Okay, we're back. We have Seth Peterson. Seth, I've talked with you before, but on a different platform. For the E3 listeners, would you mind just providing a brief intro on yourself, background, and then we can talk about the specific paper for today?
Yeah, 3 times. This is fun. Thanks for having me back. This is interesting because Chad Cook introduced me as a triple threat once, so I'm like, I always hesitate now. I'm like, I don't know if I can ever compete with that. So I'm primarily a clinician. I work pretty much 40 hours a week in the clinic. I have a practice called The Motive in Oro Valley, Arizona, which is just north of Tucson. Small little kind of boutique type setup. So that's primarily what I do. I have an adjunct faculty role at AT Still University in Mesa. So I get to drive up the road a few times a year and teach some bright-eyed students, which is always fun. And then I teach a few courses every year through the Movement Brainery, which is a Con Ed company I started a few years ago.
And what courses or specific topics do you teach at AT Still?
Pretty much whatever they ask me to do. Usually they want me to teach a course that kind of grounds the students in critical thinking. And so I usually present a patient case and try to make it maybe a little bit of a challenging patient case, and then how you might integrate the stuff that they're learning, especially in terms of clinical reasoning, with a patient like that. Because you come out of school and you always run into those patients, whether you want to or not. So kind of helping them reason through patients and showing how I did that. And then I kind of do a professional development, usually kind of a single day thing where I pop in and talk to them about what to do after you graduate, what options are out there. So I always put a plug in for some sort of post-professional training. I think that's probably going to be almost necessary maybe 10 years from now in PT.
And you also are a published author, and that's what we're going to talk about. So you recently published a paper out of JOSPT with 3 other authors. Correct me on their last names if I mispronounce them. Michelle Kleiner, John Wolfe, and Todd Davenport. That's correct. Okay, perfect. And this one was titled, go ahead.
The one you forgot, Maxi Michuk. She's PT out of Canada. So she was the second author, actually. She was huge in developing and writing the paper.
Oh, my bad. I skipped right over it. So there was 5 of y'all, and the name of this paper is Drawing a Perfect Circle, How Clinicians Can Become Better Communicators. So that's what we're going to dive into today. You've been pumping out papers over the past few years, and I appreciate it. A lot of people appreciate it. This one in particular, what was your specific reason for writing this in particular?
Oh, it's interesting. I mean, I alluded to teaching in a couple different contexts, but for one of the continuing education courses I teach, clinical reasoning is a huge part of it. And so I found myself always referencing Maitland's text when it came to communication, and then looking into, okay, what is, a little bit of the psychology literature, although I won't pretend to be an expert there. And so, I kind of just posted on Twitter, has there been any updates? I mean, what do you guys use for references? A lot of people were using the same thing. And so Todd Davenport reached out and said, hey, maybe we should write something that's maybe a modern perspective and how you can look at communication. And then we talked to Maxi, who I talked to previously about communication. I had her on a podcast that I was doing at the time. I know John Wolfe. He was one of my early mentors, and he just, maybe fortuitously, had finished up a PhD in psychology. So he was steeped in that knowledge. And then Michelle Kleiner, Maxi, kind of connected us with, who had background in reflection. And, she's, I guess, has a couple papers pending in reflective practice. So kind of all together, it ended up being a great team. But at first, it was just me, Todd, and Maxi kind of meeting and figuring out what do we want to actually talk about when it comes to communication. So those were kind of interesting discussions.
And did anyone in particular come up with the kind of framework of the the perfect circle analogy and the story as this kind of guiding starting point?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, I mean, before we got to that, I think what we kind of settled on is like when we were talking with each other about where do we feel like there's a gap in communication. I think because I don't know if you've noticed, but communication courses don't sell out. They don't have very many people that sign up for these courses. We've had a few in Tucson that are scheduled and then they back out because not enough people sign up. So I don't know what to make of that because everyone knows that it's hugely important in PT, but yeah, people don't sign up for the courses. So as we were talking about that, I think people think that because they know how to talk and people seem to like them, that they're good at communication. But like if you look at psychotherapists, psychologists, they don't think they work on it their entire career. You can always get better, just like the various skills that maybe we've historically focused on at PT. You can always get better at communicating. And I mean, how many different avenues can you go down? It's like endless. So it was kind of weird that people kind of, you graduate and people seem to like me. So I think I'm good at communicating. So, well, all right, how can we help people recognize that and that there are things that they can be conscious of, reflect on, and improve over their career? So that's how we came up with the idea of kind of pairing mindfulness and reflection. Kind of the parable aspect came in terms of the perfect circle, was me looking for how can we kind of couch this mindfulness and reflectiveness thing. And sometimes it helps to have a story do that. So I stumbled upon this old Zen parable of the perfect circle, which I think does a good job. So I don't, for the people that haven't read the paper, it's a young boy is, you can imagine this context. He's in a town, maybe a desert town where there's dirt on the ground, and he sees an old man sitting cross-legged, and he's wondering, what is this guy doing on the ground? And he looks over his shoulder and sees at that moment, this old man draws a perfect circle. So he's astounded by this and asks the old man, how did you do this? And he says, I just kept practicing. Why don't you try? And so he gives him the stick. The kid sits down. He starts practicing, and it's just attempt after attempt. He can't do it, but he keeps trying. Finally, after what seems like forever, he draws a perfect circle. And at that moment, he hears from over his shoulder, old man, how did you draw that perfect circle? So I think it cemented, I think it was perfect, and that it cemented this concept for us that this is lifelong. We're doing this stuff forever. It's a constant process in perfecting our craft.
Yeah, thank you for diving into that, all that background. Like you had alluded to, there's this lack of strong participation and interest in these communication courses and a lack of push for this in graduate level curriculum in PT school, particularly. Can you discuss what is kind of currently more emphasized in a lot of programs and maybe why you think communication and some of these things we're going to talk about today are not currently that emphasized?
Yeah, and the continuing education review paper that we did actually found that, I guess we kind of combined several different things, but we called them soft skills courses, which included communication. And that had by far the least amount of courses that were out there that were approved by states, whether it be boards or the state associations in that state. And those were actually the most supported by evidence. So it was interesting, that kind of dichotomy of they're the most supported, but they're the least actually conducted. And I'm with Eric Mira on this. I've heard him talk about it, that it comes from the consumer. I think the reason that they're not out there as much is because people don't sign up for them. I mean, if you want to go out of business, it seems like maybe you could just have a continuing education course because no one's going to sign up for it. So I think that on this specific problem, I think it probably comes from the consumer, the PTs maybe not taking an honest look and reflecting that maybe this is a skill and maybe it's something they can improve in that will actually improve your outcomes with patients. I don't think people see it that way. We kind of have a tendency to look for magic bullets and What's the most fashionable thing? And if you've noticed, I don't know, you probably have, most of those things come and go pretty quickly.
So in this paper, and you already alluded to it, there's two key elements that you all discuss and identify as two primary areas that maybe define or help produce good communication. And one of the first ones is being more mindful. And then the second one is reflection. So we'll kind of go in order. The becoming more mindful, you all kind of differentiated into three different things: attending to the self, attending to the patient, and attending to the context. Do you want to maybe discuss why y'all decided these two key elements of mindfulness and reflection, and then we can kind of go into mindfulness to start?
Yeah, I mean, so part of it, like I alluded to, that kind of prompted us writing the paper to begin with, is this concept that maybe part of it is that we're not as open to the possibility that this is a skill and something that we need to improve on. And so in order to do that, it's a little bit like everything, but you need to become aware in the moment. You need to be present with the individual. And that is such a critical aspect of communication. All right. So when you're talking with a patient in the moment, or listening to them in the moment, you kind of, if you're thinking about something else, you're going to miss individual things. We talked about, like you said, the patient, the context, and the self. And so we also thought that maybe the literature didn't recognize as often that when you're working on discrete skills, like which we talked about, like, people talk about skills in communication all the time. And when you do see communication courses, it's often couched that way. Like, here, we're going to teach you, um, whatever it might be, the specific communication skill that you can start to implement with your patients. Well, but it doesn't always take account of the context and of yourself. So the things that you do, like your body language, is hugely impactful. But if you aren't aware of what you're doing, the tone that's coming across in your voice, and then the context as you're communicating, where do you position your body? What is the patient bringing into the equation? What do you have that you're bringing into the equation at the moment? Those sorts of things don't always come into the picture. It's like, here's a skill. This is the thing that you do. You should obviously be aware and reflect on how the patient, that's often taught, how the patient is responding. But those other aspects we thought were missing. So we wanted to focus on, okay, well, you have to be mindful. You have to be aware of what's going on at the time. And then reflection. And reflection is such a nuanced topic, and you can get into the weeds with it. I mean, going back and forth with Michelle, because maybe one of the classic ways that we learn about reflection is reflection on action and reflection in action, right? It's probably something that you heard in PT school, and you did a lot of projects where you were reflecting afterward about it, right? The reflection on action sorts of things. So those are really important. It's good, I think, when you get to the end of the day, sometimes you have that space that allows you, maybe you're separated from the patient a little bit. You've had time to calm down. Your emotions have changed a little, and you have that distance where you can reflect a little bit differently. But that's different than reflection in action, is reflecting in that moment. So it might be 2 seconds after a patient says something, you're thinking about how that's impacted you, or you say something and consider what you observe in the patient after you said that. So reflecting really close to, I think, mindfulness from a time perspective. Mindfulness, you're being aware in the present moment, you're in your skin, versus reflecting might be a few seconds after that reflection in action. And then hours later, days later, you could sit back and reflect on how that interaction went. But over time, those things we kind of couched as a circle because we think being present and then reflecting later on, those things contribute to lifelong career development. If you're not present at the moment, you can't really change things at the time. You can't really be aware of things. So that's essential. And then reflection later on is essential.
Thank you for providing that, big picture view of the difference between the two, and diving into it more specifically, the attending to the self. You've already alluded to part of it, but what are some examples of what that actually looks like in the moment in a clinical encounter, and some things that you see that maybe like are commonly missed or not thought of in that moment, and things that should be kind of reoriented or thought of as the individual clinician during that initial or variety of encounters with a patient?
Yeah, I mean, there could be so many different things. It's almost limitless. But one of the things we talked about is that we thought it was important again with this to bring some more awareness to the clinician themselves. So attending to your own emotions is huge. You're the interactor in this relationship. So when you're communicating, when you're trying to understand where the patient's coming from, if you're in that position in front of the patient and you're frustrated, even if you're not visibly frustrated, that's going to impact how you might perceive what the patient's saying or where they're coming from. So if you just had an argument with your significant other and you're thinking about that when you're in the clinic, not only is it going to probably impact your behavior, but it might impact how you perceive things around you. So that's huge. And then so attending to yourself, but attending to the patient too. So having that, I guess, awareness of, this is something I think people have greater awareness of, but sitting there and observing the patient at the time. What's their tone of voice? What's their body language? And then the context. So obviously the patient brings with them an entire complex that we only scratch the surface of as an individual person. But what's the other context and the contextual factors that you can bring some awareness to? So it might be, the positioning that you're in the room, the lights in the room, someone that has a headache and you're asking them questions and you find out that, they say that they're sensitive to light. You could be aware and recognize that, hey, this is important. Maybe reflect on that and say, hey, I could dim the lights a little bit in the room, or there's a window. I could even turn the lights off and there's enough light. Touching the patient, being aware of how you use touch in your treatment. Those are some examples kind of mindfulness, I would say.
And as a student or new clinician, do you see that so much of it is just this attending to the self, or almost like over self-consciousness awareness, because you're constantly thinking of either being uncomfortable or unsure of where to go, and you're not listening to the patient, you're not understanding the context around. And when you teach or when you have had students, I'm sure as a CI, is that the biggest thing you noticed early on, is just there's so much inwardness? Obviously like you said, there's needs to be reflection and mindfulness, but it's this hyper awareness of the situation where you can't even think of the next thing or listen to the patient.
Yeah, I mean, it's really challenging as a new clinician or a student. And then, I even see fellows and they sometimes are learning and trying to implement these new ways of, getting information from the patient. And so they're focused on that information and the thought process that comes along with that, and maybe not thinking about other things. For example, I had a fellow in the clinic a few months ago, and the patient, if I remember this correctly, the patient said something about trauma in their past life, and then they paused for a minute, and the PT just asked a question about something else, some typical germane PT question, without just acknowledging that they had made kind of a big statement that I think needed to be acknowledged. And so just those little things, that we can do, I think but it's challenging. I mean, you have so much information that you're trying to assimilate, especially when you get in, just start your career as a new physical therapist or a student, to, expect yourself to be perfect on this stuff is unrealistic. I mean, and that's one of the ways we thought this might be helpful, is it's a starting point. You don't have to be perfect. In fact, with mindfulness, there's, historically even, there's kind of this acknowledgement that you won't be perfect. You can't be perfect. You just have this non-judgmental awareness of where you are and what's around you. And then you just hope over time, with that awareness and reflection, you can improve. But you don't judge yourself or think that you've done a bad job. I think that's challenging as a new clinician as well, like you alluded to, Chris, because you see other PTs in the clinic that maybe have that experience, and they might see a total knee patient, and that's, they've seen hundreds of them already. This is the first one that you've ever seen as a PT. And so it's challenging. Everything's new. But yeah, I think that happens with new PTs. That would be my maybe advice to them, is trying not to put yourself in that place of judgment. Just be aware of what's in front of you and do the best you can.
And I guess that's that point of the initial parable of it's not going to be perfect. And even over time, it's just this messy process. And would you say, because I guess the parable is saying, as an older, more experienced human, or we can say clinician, like there's going to be a perfect circle, but is that even the case in interactions with patients and healthcare, because it's so dynamic and complex?
Yeah, no, I don't think there is. We put perfect in kind of quotation marks for that reason. It's like, well, nothing's going to be perfect. I mean, and that's in a way, and we talked about this in the last line of the paper, in a way, that's kind of the great thing about being a clinician, is there's always something you can improve on. I mean, how boring would it be if you perfected physical therapy after 10 years of practice or 20 years of practice? What would the next 20 years be like? Oh, it would just be horrible. So there's always room to improve or try different things. I mean, I remember going to a course I thought this was inspirational myself, with Michael Moore, and the guy's in his mid 70s, and he's busting out new things that he just learned. Like, okay, I'm going to try this with some. And, after the course, someone said something like, maybe, I wouldn't have done it that way. And I'm just thinking to myself, that's, he's in his mid 70s. I mean, he's still trying new things. I think that should be, they should be commended for that. I hope that if I'm still practicing, I try to improve in any way that I possibly can. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's such a thing as perfect. I've seen really fantastic physical therapists and mentors screw up with patients. We all do. You just hope that you get a little bit better over time and recognize it a little bit earlier when you do.
Going to the more of the reflection, you had mentioned those two differential types of reflection: in the moment, and then, like you said, hours, days, months later. Do you have ideas of how individuals can go through that reflective process in regards to maybe in the moment, if they're reflecting on something a patient said or something they found clinically, how to immediately utilize that reflection? And then the reflection after the fact, is there ways that you'd recommend going through this active process of reflecting in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it probably varies. And I don't know, from an academic perspective and describing it, there's a difference between reflection in action and mindfulness. But even among our group, it is kind of splitting hairs a little bit. So I think in real life, there's probably minimal difference that you would perceive between those. So you're being aware. You could think of mindfulness as almost like the state that you're putting yourself in, and reflection might be the things that you're noticing, that you're bringing to your awareness that you might think about changing. So like you've noticed that the patient looks uncomfortable, and you think, maybe I could they're a lumbar spine patient. Maybe I can put a pillow behind their lower back. Different things like that. It's a subtle way of showing that you care, that you're aware of what they're going through. It's acknowledging their discomfort. Little things like that. I think just noticing moments in the interaction with the patient where you can do that might be a good place to start. And then reflection on action would be later on. Is there a way that you can do this? This is where I think it totally differs depending on the person and your preferences. So, Joe Farrell, for example, I spoke with him and said that every day on his drive home, he had a decent drive home every day after the clinic. And that would be the moment that he would keep the radio off and reflect on the patients that he saw that maybe he was struggling with. And so that's an opportunity. I think we each have some sort of commute to work. So that's one opportunity. I think, there's throughout history, people have used journaling. That's another example. You could reflect on your day at the end of the day. You could have a little journal where you write down, this is a patient I'm struggling with. You could send yourself a little email or go in the little note tab at your phone. Hey, I want to look up, this specific issue. I'm having this problem. Or talking to colleagues afterward. I think those are examples of maybe reflection on action. You alluded to me writing a few papers. When I started, it was case reports. I'm a huge fan of case reports, not just for a person that consumes them, but as a person who's in the clinic. I think they're a good opportunity to kind of take a more deep dive into a specific issue or a patient. And it's amazing what you can learn doing that then you never forget. You can implement all that information with patients you see in the future. So I think those are good examples. You do podcasts. That's another example where you can sit there and reflect and think about how maybe you can implement that stuff into your practice.
The clinic I'm at, a close buddy of mine I work with, at the end of the day, I'll go into like a private treatment room and be finishing notes, and he'll come in, pop his head in and ask, how's my day? And just a little check-in. And then I don't know how much of it is a reflection versus just like a venting session, but in the moment, just literally talking it out allows me to, instead of just, shutting my brain off as I go home and then not thinking about work until the next day, it's like kind of a recap at the end of the day. And as I'm pretty much venting, it does allow me to reflect. And then there's discussion that comes from that. And then he'll, kind of summarize his day. And it's just this very like informal, but habitual process pretty much every night. That's very therapeutic. And there's really not a lot of like direction or answers we're giving each other. It's more so just we're allowing each other to talk it out and listen. And then there's not really a plan for solution. It's just, this is what happened today. These were the good things. These were the bad. So as you were talking, I guess that made me think of, maybe that is my like daily reflection that I didn't even think of was happening, but I'm really glad it's there because it is extremely kind of therapeutic for myself and allows me to reflect on that day.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, I would imagine there are times though when you probably talk about a patient and then you realize like, this patient is maybe bothering me more than I thought they were once you start talking about them. And I guess as you were talking too, Chris, I noticed that, hey, we all kind of write about our patients anyway because we have to document them at the end of the day. So that's a good opportunity, I think, that we all have to reflect on why we did what we did. That's a good opportunity, I think, to maybe take a little bit longer and think, okay, are they moving along how I would expect? Yeah.
Do you have any advice on how to not allow reflection to turn into rumination, because that feels very common for me as a new grad over this past year. Of maybe it starts out as reflection or just thinking, and then I can't stop, and then it doesn't become productive anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think there again, there could probably be several different things that depend on the person. It might just be setting aside time to reflect. And then again, it might be maybe a principle for mindfulness would be you get to the end and you take a breath and just kind of realize, okay, I'm, try not to judge yourself. These are facts that you considered. You are a person, you're trying your best, and that's all you can do. That's kind of challenging, I think, as a new PT. But I remember whenever it hit, that maybe it wasn't up to me to fix the patients. That at the end of the day, I could just do as good as I could, and they had to help me out. And there were other factors outside of either one of our control. So we're just doing as good as we can.
Is there anything, all of this is practical, and it gives direction after you read the paper, but anything that you've noticed in yourself, or that you kind of discuss with either the fellows that you said you've worked with, or other students at AT Still, or other students that you've worked with in the clinic, of these are some quick things that we can change about how I'm noticing your effectiveness or maybe ineffectiveness with certain parts of communication, that we can implement almost immediately with the next patient or the next day?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. There's a couple things. The first thing that came to mind was what I alluded to with this fellow. What we talked about was empathy communication. So it's just getting good at making a statement. That could be one way, but making a statement that expresses empathy. Like, that must have been very difficult for you. Thank you for sharing that. Simple things like that. If you have a patient that says they got worse after the session, saying something like, thank you for sharing that, thanking them for sharing that they got worse. There are tons of things in terms of empathy communication, but you guys can look that up. There's tons of resources about empathy communication online. Maybe some other things. We broke it down in one of our figures. We talked about if one of the things that we want you to do is become more aware, more mindful in the clinic, it would make sense that maybe you practice training that awareness. So meditation is one way that you can do that. It doesn't have to be a long time, but you just try and bring your attention to something. The most classic way is breathing, because no matter where you are, you always have your breath. So that's one way that you can practice training your attention. So it's maybe over time becomes a little bit easier. It's not perfect. And, no one has this, you're not expected to have this quiet mind or blissful feeling every time you meditate. It's just about training your attention. The other thing we said was think big, start small. That was another concept that we think might improve your mindfulness. So being aware of yourself, the patient, and the context, but also recognizing it's okay to just start with one thing, like we talked about, maybe being a little forgiving. There's also a nice acronym when it comes to mindfulness. The acronym is STOP, which stands for slow down, stop, take a breath, observe, and proceed. So wherever you are, maybe it's between patients, you stop for a second, you take a breath, you observe maybe how internally you're feeling at the time. There are great little tips. Abraham Verghese talks about when he washes his hands between patients, he takes a moment and visualizes that one patient is getting washed off and he's getting prepared for the next patient mentally and emotionally. so you can take a similar moment. Ron Epstein talks about how he would sitting and talking with a patient. Sometimes he felt it helpful to just bring awareness to his feet in his shoes, what that felt like. So those are little things, little moments that you can take to just kind of bring your awareness back to the present moment, because it's easy for your mind to be floating around thinking about other things in the clinic. And the other things in terms of improving reflection were maybe embracing curiosity, which is something I think, prompted this whole paper, but being open and curious about what can you do to improve, maybe where you're, making mistakes in the clinic, maybe where you're having some successes too, and trying to learn from patients and, learn something every day and trying to continually reflect. So, you're thinking about reflecting in the moment, and you're also taking time at the end of the day. I think all of those things, if you do those, I think you're implementing this stuff in the clinic.
You all discuss towards the end the reality and the barriers with the examples you alluded to, and just the reflection and mindfulness process in a very busy clinic setting. Do you have any advice for those that are in the busiest of settings, that's maybe a mill clinic or just so back to back? Is it really the same things you mentioned, just it has to be done more frequently because they may be seeing 25, 30 patients a day? What are your thoughts on the barriers when there's just so much?
Yeah, I mean, if we talked about the context earlier, is one thing you could be aware of and mindful of. That's a lot of the time that's what it is. That's changed in our clinics, where it's just a busy clinic. So if you're in maybe a clinic where you see one patient an hour, it's like ours kind of is, and it's more quiet. You can hear like a fountain in the waiting room. It's probably easier to be more aware and mindful and reflect. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. In fact, it probably means it's even more important when you're in those busy clinics. I've been in one before. I used to work in a clinic just like that. Patients, there's 6 clinicians. There'd always be patients. It was loud. You have to implement this in that sort of a clinic setting because there's so many distractions that you're surrounded with. You're like in a pool full of distractions. So I think it becomes challenging. But like we talked about, maybe you could focus on ways that you can improve your ability to be aware just through practice. Don't expect that you're going to be perfect. But yeah, I mean, I think that means it's even more important. One of the other barriers we talked about is that, and maybe one of the reasons people don't sign up for these courses, I'm not sure, is this perception that, because this is a quote unquote soft skill, that it's not that important. It's too psychological. It doesn't have a direct impact in outcomes. And I think especially when it comes to outcomes, I don't think anything could be further from the truth. In fact, building a therapeutic alliance, understanding your patient, helping communicate just simple things is just the bedrock of everything that we do. So, yeah, I think in those busy settings, the situations where there are barriers, it's almost as if those are even more important to implement this stuff.
Because you're now you're a clinic owner and you created this clinic, what are the things that, now that you have full control over that, what are the major things that you wanted? You talked about a few, but what are the major things you wanted in this clinic to create that environment for comfortability and openness with patients? What all did you think about or still kind of consider?
Yeah, and we're actually building a building too across the parking lot in a different space. We're leasing this space, and so I got to work with an architect and think about that when it came to building a physical therapy space, which is kind of a cool experience. So, yeah, I mean, it's everything from maybe let me just tell you what the architect said, because I was talking to this architect designing this newer space, and what he told me when I talked about, hey, I want to visualize what it would be like to be a patient, to walk in this place and just feel the instant you walked in like this was a healing atmosphere, like have the feeling that you walk in and you feel like this is where I'm going to get better. What would you need for that to be the case? And then walking through, what do you need to do? So we have private treatment rooms. Like I talked about in this space, we put a little fountain by the entryway. It's relatively quiet. But we have gym space here. We have a space, separate. We have a space that we can walk people to, where then they can work hard and exercise that's closer to where the music is. And we have, I don't know if you guys have messed around with this, but we have Alexa in my clinic, and I've tried different things with it, playing music that I know the patient likes when they come in, playing more calming music when a patient seems really ramped up. I've tried it for a week. I would ask Alexa to play music from the year they graduated high school, so which kind of brings people back and they feel a little younger, I found. But sometimes it was interesting because people would be like, "Oh, I hate music from that year," which, all right, I can get that. I mean, but yeah, so different things like that. But it was funny because talking to the architect, he said, okay, so he was, making notes, and we kind of looked at all these different things that we could do. But afterward, he said, hey, I've worked with a few different PT clinics, but they're always interested in things like sight lines and like making sure that they can see all the patients that are there, and so they can bill for it. So totally different perspective. I mean, it's a perspective, and I understand it's business. You got to make money, but I think there's a way to do both. So I think bringing some awareness to this is huge. So I would encourage people. Yeah, I mean, there's always things that you can do. I mean, even in those busy clinics, if you don't have private treatment rooms, there's that little sheet sometimes that you can pull out, but nobody uses it to like separate the table. That still offers some sense of privacy for patients. So little things like that. Imagine what it would be like if you had your knee replaced and you haven't taken a shower for 4 days, and you're someone that really gets dolled up for everywhere you go, and you haven't taken a shower, and you're, half naked with your scar hanging out, and you're surrounded by other people. I mean, it's just probably not a good feeling for that person. So
the clinics I've been in the outpatient setting, my rotations, and now the clinic I'm at now, they've all been a very open floor plan, open clinic and evaluation structure. So we have private treatment rooms, but they're pretty much just for the chiropractic staff that has their own separate rooms. We have one or two available potentially for the PTs, but pretty much all of our evaluations are 4 or 5 plinths all lined up. And so we could be evaluating a patient, they're seated at edge of table, and then there's 2 or 3 or 4 other patients. And I see the pros and cons, because sometimes it's just so overly stimulating, either to the therapist, myself, or to the patient, or both. But I also see the benefit of, as we're going through an evaluation, they see what treatment may look like. Of they're seeing the patient behind me like pushing a sled, or they're seeing another like total knee doing rehab 2 tables down. So I don't know what's a better situation. There's been a few times an individual, I think there's only been once where I brought them into the room. He's blind, and it was just a much more comfortable environment for him to be in a private room. But all the others, I think that the pros of being in that setting where it's like they're establishing their expectations for what this looks like and feels like, but also it can feel very overstimulating. So I don't know what's a better, and maybe it's just patient dependent, but I've never been in a setting like yours where it's like every evaluation I'm in a private treatment room and it's really quiet and they're not seeing other patients around them.
Yeah, and I do think we don't see a ton of athletes anymore, but that would be an example. Like I imagine, the place I used to work, seeing someone after their ACL gets repaired and you're trying to get back to tennis, and, you're a high school athlete, you want to be out there. You want to have other people motivating you, and it's different personality and different context again. So I think being aware of all of that, the person that, again, like I said, just had back surgery or had their knee replaced and is, used to having that privacy and looking good, maybe you have them in a private treatment room, but then, the patient that had their ACL repaired or sprained their ankle and they're a month out. Yeah, they might be, it might be even better to have that sort of setting that motivates them.
Is there any advice or suggestions you have from a curriculum standpoint for institutions on how maybe this particular topic or communication more broadly can be taught and implemented before a student starts a series of clinical rotations?
Yeah, no, I think that would be, Todd, one of the authors said that Todd Davenport said he was going to use this with his patients, with his students rather, to help teach communication a little bit. So I think this could be a good resource. I think something like this with communication, I'm not a curriculum guy, right? I'm a clinician. So how would I imagine this, or how have we done it for the continuing education company? We've mixed it in with other things. So I think you can have standalone course on communication. I think that would be great. But I also would hope that people take away the idea that we're always communicating every second in the clinic, whether it's with our body, how we position ourselves, not just the words we say, but how we say them or what we don't say. All of those things are a version of communication. And so we need to think of it as just like we're surrounded by it. So in my opinion, there would be opportunities to use this stuff, reflection and being aware. Maybe you're taught it as a student, and then it's something that you do all the time. You're doing a course in manual therapy, learning it in school, and before you do it, there's a moment where you try to bring your awareness to what you're doing. You're taking a second, and then you go in and do what you do instead of, maybe chit-chatting at the same time and, talking about what happened during the weekend. You're bringing your full awareness and then taking a second as a group afterward or individually to reflect on, okay, how did that go? Where do we need to keep practicing? Things like that. I think you could do that all the time, probably in every course.
Is there anything else from this paper or more broadly that you feel like we haven't discussed or that you want to chat about?
Not really. I mean, I think there is that table 2, which is an example of, it's kind of a case example. We tried to present a patient that, if the listeners, I guess, have access to that, they can go through that case and look at how you might implement this stuff in a real patient interaction, so that when we're talking about this, I think sometimes it comes off as really philosophical and it doesn't have to. This is real stuff that you're doing. It's tangible. So what we tried to do is bring that home in that table where this is a real patient. These are examples of things that you're doing or you could do, the PT, that would implement these things, being mindful and reflective with that individual. So I think that would be a good thing for people to look at. There was a lot of talk. In fact, most of the revision happened in that table. We wanted it to be a maybe not black and white case. So you might disagree with how we manage that patient or the things exactly how they were said. But ultimately, the goal with that table was to just demonstrate that, this is a PT being aware, being reflective, making the decision to do these things. Again, it's not always perfect, but, you're doing this stuff So those are examples of how you can do it and implement it in the clinic, which I think is hopefully helpful. So it's not so philosophical.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate all you do and all of the research you've pumped out. Is there anything on the horizon that you're currently working on or that you're excited to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple things right now, but maybe germane to this, there was um, a paper from Physical Therapy Journal um, that was about specifically storytelling in physical therapy practices. Uh, how I'm trying to think of the exact title because it got revised, but I think how stories help us see ourselves is the ultimate name of the title. So it covers some of this when we talk about reflection on action. So how we as clinicians can reflect on our practice by thinking about those stories, and specifically in that paper we talked about our own story, because we talk a lot and reflect a lot on the patient, but as we talked about in this current paper in JOSPT, it's also us. I mean, patient relationships are dyadic. There's the patient and provider, and oftentimes the insurance company kind of nudges its way in there. But it's primarily those two, right? And so you're an important part of it, reflecting on your journey and who you are as a clinician and how it went, how you're developing, and what your story is. I think that's important.
Awesome. Well, we will call it there. Thank you so much, Seth.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.